Hi there. Yeah, so I'm Charlotte Zamor. I'm a master's student at the University of Cambridge in History and Philosophy of Science. And today I'm going to be speaking about sharpening the tool of cognitive diversity, an investigation of the relationship between diversity, consensus, and dissent. I'm going to start with a disclaimer, as all good presentations start. This is very much a work in progress, so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak here so that I can have all feedback and everything. So please be as brutal as possible because it's only going to benefit me. So I wanted to start with the aims of the project. So I have three broad aims that I'm really keen on achieving. So the first one is to understand, it's kind of my launch point, is to understand the relationship between diversity and consensus. So I have this broad intuition that lots of our arguments on the benefit of cognitive diversity in the sciences particularly, but this extends to all areas of epistemology. We have this kind of implicit assumption that diversity is to help us gain a better consensus, gain a better kind of homogenized opinion. And I'm going to be critiquing that idea quite a bit. And I also want to develop an account of the epistemic benefits of diversity that's compatible with philosophies that don't assume that the best practices culminate in consensus. So here I'm talking about pluralism, relativism, all of those philosophies that don't have the same kind of prima facie obligation that the best practices must form a consensus. And I believe that this will enable a more targeted approach to, firstly, understanding a broader range of epistemic practices, and also conceiving of ways to produce a better or to improve inquiry in each of these epistemic practices in a more detailed way. So the setup of this presentation, so I'm going to give an overview of the kind of state-of-the-art status quo arguments in favor of cognitive diversity, or rather the roles cognitive diversity play. I'm going to be outlining the problems with these views and why we should, raise an eyebrow. How we should interpret these problems, what kind of underlies them, and then how we can conceive of some solutions. So I'm going to start with this quote, which really kind of started me on this track, and it's a quote by Miriam Solomon in a paper which she talks about exactly this question, like how much diversity should we be incorporating into our epistemic systems, what is the purpose of diversity, and how we can kind of tailor diversity to our needs. And she essentially says, diversity is a blunt epistemic tool with more than one route to improving the social distribution of research effort, knowledge, and creating new theories. So the bits that I've highlighted in yellow are the key points which I want you to take from this quote. So first of all, the relationship between diversity and epistemic benefits is blunt, by which I'm interpreting she means there's a relationship between diversity and epistemic benefits that is many to many. So if you imagine like a sharp tool is when you have a tool and its use and it's kind of direct and there's nothing else that could do that specific function, whereas we have lots of different kinds of diversity and lots of different epistemic functions, and it's kind of fuzzy and blunt. And also crucially, she's assuming that diversity is instrumental here, as opposed to having some kind of intrinsic value. And lastly, diversity is generally good for these three things, which is obtaining distribution of research effort, distributing knowledge, and gaining new theories. So this is like the status quo, diversity is blunt view. Okay, so who talks about diversity more broadly in the literature? And I've identified two main groups of philosophers that engage either implicitly or explicitly with this question of cognitive diversity and its role in science. And I've called them rather tellingly the consensus and the normative pluralists. And as I'm sure you can tell by my abstract, I am not a consensor, but I will also be showing that we shouldn't all be normative pluralists either. But essentially what the consensus believe, whether they talk about this explicitly or implicitly, is that the best epistemic practices culminate in a consensus. Therefore, the instrumental benefit of diversity is in aid of this overarching goal of consensus. So here I've identified Kevin Zollman, Boaz Miller, Miriam Solomon to a certain extent as well. Whereas the epistemic normative pluralists are these are the philosophers that outwardly reject any kind of basis of consensus, and rather they are advocates for a much more plural scientific practice where, to use Febran's famous phrase, anything goes, that we should invest in lots of different methods. We should never have harmful homogeneity, and everything should kind of be as plural for as long as possible. I want to specify, I've put the normative in I've stressed normative here because to some extent, everyone who advocates for diversity must be a pluralist in some way, because diversity is the position that there is some kind of pluralism. But crucially, the consensus hold that this diversity at some point in scientific inquiry will collapse and will have a homogeneous answer, essentially. So that's why I've stressed the normative. And there's three main epistemic functions of diversity that all of the philosophers in these two categories agree on. So there's preventing alternatives, dividing cognitive labor, and overcoming bias. So these are the three main epistemic functions of diversity, if you will. So here I've drawn a schematic of all of, maybe not all, maybe that's sticking my neck out too far, of what people are saying about these three arguments, what the two groups of people are saying about these three arguments. So it's kind of like a summary of all of the current arguments in favor of diversity. So I'll just run through this really quickly, just to give you an indication of what the credences of these academics are. So let's start with presenting alternatives. So the consensus think that the only way we can justify consensus on one theory is when that theory is the best of the bunch. So the many formal epistemologists like Kitcher and Zollman are really concerned with the social dynamics that come into play and determine what causes a consensus on a certain theory. And they're really concerned with how they can modify the structure of a scientific community in order to ensure that when consensus does take place, it's more likely than not to be convergence on a correct theory or the most justified theory. Whereas the normative pluralists, on the other hand, argue that the reason why diversity is so beneficial for presenting alternatives is because the very presence of an alternative highlights that choosing a single theory can only ever be arbitrary. So here, Mill has his famous saying, the tyranny of the majority, where when everyone agrees on something, you kind of lose the basis to justify your own position. And he's very concerned with that. So dividing cognitive labor. So the consensus argue that diversity is very good for dividing labor because in order to justify consensus, we need to give each of the correct theories its due, right? We need to investigate it to the point where we can either rule it out or we can be confident that that's the theory that we should all converge on. So crucially, this is one of the famous arguments that's used against things like a token hiring of women and minorities, because it's not just the presence of one individual that does this important work, but rather we need an effective division of labor so that we can invest equitably in the options that we have. On the other hand, the normative pluralists have a very different thesis for why dividing cognitive labor is important. And so here I'm thinking about Nancy Cartwright's famous dappled world thesis, where, ontological space itself requires a division of labor because ontological space itself is plural. There are many different theories that we need in order to tailor each different kind of area of inquiry. So that way, division of cognitive labor is necessary just because of the way the world, in fact, is. And then lastly, overcoming bias is another argument that's often used to support cognitive diversity. And the consensus view bias, or rather overcoming bias, is necessary to ensure that when we have a collective allegiance towards one theory, we have to be sure that it's because that's the right theory and not just because of a collective bias. Whereas the normative pluralist would argue that the integration of different ways of thinking, so everyone is partial and biased, but it's only through recognizing that someone is biased in a different way, that we can kind of come to know our own biases. I'll talk about this quite a bit later on. So this is the state of the art. So yeah, I've added this quote from Sandra Mitchell to illustrate the consensus view, crystal clearly, which is that the community's goal is to arrive at universal acceptance of a theory. The slogan here is pluralism, the way to unity. Whereas, of course, the normative pluralists would say pluralism, full stop, essentially. Okay, I just wanted to add one more layer of complication before I hopefully bring in some clarifying interpretations and solutions. And that is, there's another way to carve up the space here between those scholars who talk about cognitive diversity that doesn't necessarily follow this pluralism consensus line, but rather we can divide the argument in favor of cognitive diversity along the line of what we think diversity, what should be done with diversity once it's there. So, I've split this section into those who think that diverse views should be aggregated in order to reap their benefits, and those who argue that diversity should be playing like a critical engagement role in order to be beneficial for scientific inquiry. And there's also fierce debate between these two groups on what the proper epistemic function of diversity is. So it's really important to introduce this. On the side of the aggregationists, people like, I think Miriam Solomon has probably spoken about this the most, where she's really concerned with this phenomenon called groupthink, where if you get a bunch of diverse people in a room together, and for example, she talked a lot about these medical consensus conferences, where essentially a load of different doctors are locked in a room and told they have to agree. So she's really concerned that in situations like this, even those insightful and beneficial diverse views, they kind of get stifled by different power relations. Those who perceive to have greater epistemic authority will kind of shut down dissenters, even though those dissenting views might be, extremely valuable. So she thinks that rather than have diverse people with diverse opinions, kind of hash it out, we should rather just aggregate those views in something like a systematic review, see what people are saying, rather than corrupt this kind of beneficial diversity by getting people to critically engage. And in a different way, but with a similar message, Cartwright and Longino are very wary of the fact that diversity shouldn't play a discursive role, because the diversity that we need in science itself is just a manifestation of the pluralism that is the ontological world. So it doesn't really make sense to get someone who is a sociologist to critically engage with a fundamental physicist, because what they're doing is essentially mapping different ontological spaces. And so if we want to have a complete picture of the natural world, then what we need is to aggregate lots of different ways of thinking, as opposed to get them to critically engage. On the other hand, the discursive supporters, people like John Stuart Mill and Paul Feyerabend. I put Longino here again, and as you can see, I've put Longino in all of these categories because she's written so much on each of these views. So I don't know, I guess Longino is putting different hats on in each of these different categories. But there's this idea that is very much expressed in On Liberty, in Mill's On Liberty, that it's only through rational deliberation, it's only through kind of engaging with our dissenters that we can really be justified in our own views. So this is like his overall message, that we need to seek out dissenters or people who disagree with us as a necessary justification exercise. And Paul Feyerabend represents a very similar thesis. It's this idea that diversity is so valuable because disagreement is so valuable, and we need people to disagree. So that you can, again, split the line across these two in a different way. So yeah, the reason I wanted to introduce this second way of dividing the literature is to represent the heterogeneity of the two groups, And to also emphasize that this idea that that I introduced at the beginning of the talk, Miriam Solomon's quote about diversity being blunt, diversity, I hope you appreciate that cognitive diversity is an extremely hazy concept that lots of people have talked about, quite forcefully, but in a disunified and quite chaotic way. So now let's move on to the problems, as if there weren't enough problems already. So as I hope you can start to sense that it's not simply that there are just lots of benefits of diversity, but that these two lines that I have drawn, the arguments on either side of these lines, are mutually incompatible. You can't both think that diversity is beneficial because we need to aggregate lots of different viewpoints, and also think that diversity is beneficial because lots of people need to hash it out and disagree with one another. Equally, it doesn't necessarily make sense to argue that diversity is really useful for generating alternatives if you then argue that those alternatives are necessary to justify a consensus. So what this means is that if we really want to argue that cognitive diversity is epistemically beneficial, then we need to get to grips with the underlying epistemic and philosophical credences that underlie each of these positions. Just to illustrate this point, I've re-highlighted the top of this table that I drew to show that you can't both hold that consensus on one theory is justified as the best of the bunch, and then also maintain like the Malayan view that the presence of viable alternatives highlights that choosing a single theory can only be arbitrary. These are different viewpoints, and we need to get clearer. Additionally, if we turn to the practice of science itself, then we have different layers, different kinds of support and refutation for each of these arguments that I've drawn. So sometimes, in specific circumstances, each one of these arguments seems to be very persuasive. For example, I'll just draw one of these examples, and we can talk about it at the end, because I'm aware that I've probably spoken for a long time already. But let's look at something like the behavioral sciences. So behavioral science is made of lots of different disciplines, such as, I've got them here: neurobiology, social environment approaches, behavioral genetics. And each one of these, subdisciplines is made up of, they ask different questions, they use different methods, they have different assumptions, crucially. And so it's not necessarily clear that rational deliberation is appropriate when it comes to behavioral science, because it's not necessarily clear that two disciplines that operate within completely different idealizing assumptions should really be critically engaging with one another. Alternatively, an example such as the female orgasm is exactly the kind of place where critical engagement has been so fruitful. We lots of the earlier work in the scientific study of the female orgasm was operating within this assumption of adaptationism, where all of our functions should be kind of optimized for adaptation purposes, whereas Elizabeth Lloyd famously argued that the female orgasm is like a foil to this adaptationist assumption, and it's crucially within feminist diversity that the limitations of adaptationism have come to the fore. So essentially what this is telling us is that referring to the actual practice of science itself is not the best, or it's not necessarily the most obvious way to justify the epistemic benefits of diversity. However, what actual scientific practice does show really well is that diversity can and does perform all of these different functions in different scenarios. So maybe we shouldn't be looking for, a blanket set of justifications for cognitive diversity, but we really need to pay attention to the actual practice of science itself. So can we get more precise than this? Can we, rather than thinking that diversity is hazy and blunt and sometimes beneficial in this way and sometimes beneficial in that way, can we get more precise? Yes, we can. And to argue this, I've introduced Alvin Goldman's system of justification. I think this is a really helpful way to think about how we can understand when and where these different arguments apply. So Alvin Goldman split beliefs into, we have two different kinds of beliefs that we can make about the world. The first one is just a general belief about the world. For example, it's going to rain tomorrow. And a second order belief is a belief about the reliability or the credence or the justification of my first order belief. So for example, it's going to rain tomorrow. This is a justified belief because I checked the BBC weather app and BBC weather is reliable. So BBC weather is reliable is an example of like a second order claim. And crucially, a second order beliefs are constructed within, an epistemic system, and I've got a definition of epistemic systems here that you can see. And so essentially the point I want to emphasize here is that different people operating within different epistemic systems, so diverse epistemic systems, will have a diversity of second order beliefs. So that's the main point. And so the reason why I think it's so important to introduce this is because Goldman's framework has been used quite a bit in the philosophy of disagreement in recent years. So, for example, let's say I hold that it's going to rain tomorrow because the BBC weather app says so. And let's say my friend Bob comes up to me and says, oh, it's not going to rain tomorrow. And why? So we're obviously in a state of disagreement. And so to resolve that disagreement, both of us kind of inspect our second order beliefs, and then we kind of identify which one of us has erred in some way in that process of moving from our second order beliefs into our first order beliefs. One of us has made a mistake. So let's say I say, I believe it's going to rain tomorrow and this is justified because BBC weather is reliable. And let's say Bob tells me that the meteorological models that the BBC uses have recently been refuted, then obviously I would have an issue with my second order belief, would have to update and then come to realize that I have in fact made a mistake. But what's interesting is when people form second order beliefs from beyond each other's epistemic systems. So let's say that I'm operating within an epistemic system in which I believe that prayer has a direct causal impact on the weather tomorrow. So I say it's going to rain tomorrow. My second order belief is that I said a prayer that it's going to rain tomorrow. Therefore, it must rain tomorrow because of the causal relationship between prayer and rain. And so if Bob now comes along and says, oh, this is an unjustified belief because of the BBC, it's not necessarily clear that I would have to update my belief based on that conversation that we've had. And so we fall into a state of what's known as these faultless disagreements, where two people disagree, but none of them have really made a mistake because each one of them is justified given their epistemic system. So now how can we apply this framework of first order and second order beliefs back into the literature on the consensus and the normative pluralists in cognitive diversity? So my main claim is that the consensus view requires a prior or a meta-consensus of second order belief. So the only kind of diversity which is tolerated by the consensus is diversity of first order beliefs. So we can see this quite a lot in the literature, where people like Boas-Miller use words like social calibration, or Stendenger talks about constraint. We have meta-consensus, where essentially what all of these arguments are trying to say is that before we analyze a certain agreement, there needs to be a prior agreement before that agreement has taken place, which, you can see this is already quite like this is only going to apply in very certain situations. For example, in like a medical consensus conference, where consensus is kind of like the presumption and the output, one of those weird situations. Just to go into this a little bit more, in fact, I don't go into this a little bit more. Sorry, I must have cut that slide out. But yeah, essentially the main point I want to argue is that consensus tolerate a very limited amount of diversity. They only tolerate diversity of first order beliefs. And this is why we get this weird tension, because even though we're talking about diversity in all of these different arguments, really the consensus are making quite a narrow claim about where diversity should be. Whereas on the other hand, the normative pluralists have a much more open system. If we think about Paul Feyerabend's counter-inductive method, anything goes. You can have a diversity of first order beliefs, diversity of second order beliefs. If you're coming to me and saying that it's going to rain tomorrow because I said a prayer, then I have every epistemic obligation to take you seriously. And it's only through this process of engaging with people who not only have different first order epistemic beliefs, but also completely different second order epistemic beliefs and different epistemic systems, that's where the power of diversity is. That's how we can really progress. I've also put in Longinger's local epistemologies here. So that's the main difference between these two arguments, is that they underlying each of them is a different credence of where diversity can and should be. So this is a short summary. So consensus versus normative pluralists. Are we talking about first order or second order diversity? Okay, so how can we put this newfound interpretation to work? How can we get clearer on using this scheme in actual scientific practice to determine where diversity should be sharpened or focused on and its precise functions? So I've drawn a little schematic here. By the way, how am I doing on time? I can't see my clock.
You've got about 10 minutes, Charlotte.
Oh, that's perfect. Okay, that's great. So I'm on the solution. So I'm on the last bit, as you can see. Okay, so I've drawn this little schematic here. So let's suppose we have two individual agents, agent A and agent B, and agent A is saying given X, P, and agent B is saying given X, Y. So I want to argue that diversity is going to be the most valuable in each epistemic scenario when we have the greatest point of disagreement or contrast, or when we're drawing the greatest inference, or where we have opportunity for disagreement. That's where diversity is going to be the most beneficial. And so I've drawn 4 different epistemic scenarios of where this disagreement can happen. And each one of these is dependent on whether we're talking about first order claims or second order claims. So in scenario 1, we have the situation in which, so both X's are the same, both X's are first order claims, so they're claims about the world. And let's say that A and B are disagreeing. So one of them is saying, this claim about the world is true because of P, and this another person saying this claim about the world is true because of Y. So in this kind of way, we have a diversity of explanations for a certain claim. So you can imagine, like, it's going to rain tomorrow because I checked my BBC weather app, and it's going to rain tomorrow because I looked at another weather app, for example. Oh, sorry, that would be a second order example. So first order example would be 2 people say the same claims about the same things. So diversity would be, we have a diversity of different claims of different things. And so when we're in scenario 2, when we have a diversity of epistemic systems, so X and Y are now going to be claims, they're going to be second order claims that we're making. So when we have a diversity of second order claims, then we have like a richer basis we have like a richer number of explanations for a given phenomenon. And then when X and Y are different, in scenario 3, we now have a division of labor. We have 2 agents who are talking about completely different things. They might be operating within the same epistemic system, but for example, one of them is talking about whether it's going to rain tomorrow. Someone else is talking about what the wind is going to be like tomorrow, for example. And when we're in scenario 4, now this is a bit of a head scratch, this one, and I haven't quite got my head around this one yet. But this is when 2 people will be making 2 different claims from within 2 different epistemic systems. So, for example, someone's talking about wind and the association between wind and prayer, and someone else is talking about the relationship between rain and the BBC. So, presumably, or rather, the normative pluralists really want to say that diversity is going to be beneficial in a case like this as well. And it does seem like they're right, and there are examples of when they're right, but this is definitely the scenario that needs more concentration and more kind of careful analysis, because it's not necessarily so obvious that when two different epistemic agents are operating within different epistemic systems and making completely different claims, that diversity itself would be like a beneficial state. So how can we summarize all these different epistemic systems and epistemic situations? So essentially what I want to show is that the benefit of diversity is conditional on whether we are constructing first or second order beliefs. Diversity is playing a different function in each of those scenarios that I drew. Different kinds of scientific inquiry are differentially concerned with first order and second order beliefs. So if you go back to the historical examples that I used before, in the next slide, I'll go back to them. We can see that each one of the different examples that I drew on is kind of in a different business when it comes to constructing first order or second order beliefs. I'll clarify this next. And therefore, arguments for the benefit of diversity they only make sense, or they must specify the epistemic activities that they're referring to. So rather than diversity being hazy and uncertain, diversity can become sharp as long as we integrate conversations with diversity. We kind of contextualize these arguments within specific scientific practices. Yeah, so the next step would be taking a deeper look at actual scientific practices and seeing how the four epistemic situations that I've constructed fit in. So just to end off, let's go back to the behavioral science example. So this would be the kind of example where we're making different first order claims about the world, but we're operating from within different second order belief systems. So, for example, if you are concerned with the way the environment influences behavior, you're going to be making certain assumptions about genetics and situations, and then drawing conclusions. Whereas if you're concerned about the genetic contributions of behavior, you are going to be making certain idealizing assumptions about the environment. So in situations like this, when we're making first order or second order claims, diversity is going to be located, or rather, beneficially located in different parts of the inquiry. And I've put exploratory experiments here because I think this is a really interesting example. So an exploratory experiment is when we don't really know what's going on. And the only knowledge that we have is kind of taken from the immediate material conditions of the experiment itself. And so the reason why this is such an interesting example is because we're almost operating outside of an epistemic system here. We don't have any of the concepts yet. We're in a case of pre-normal science, to use the Kuhnian term. And so here it really does seem that diversity should be beneficial. We should have an effective division of cognitive labor, but we need to kind of take a deeper look on the status of first order and second order epistemic claims in order to kind of add the meat to the bones on where diversity is going to be beneficial in a case like this. And it's not necessarily clear that it's going to be in a kind of discursive or kind of critical way. So what does all of this mean? I know that the last part of this presentation has been, I've maybe presented more problems than solutions, but again, that's the fact that this is a project in its early stages. But the overall message that I've really tried to emphasize throughout is that the arguments in favor of the benefit of diversity must specify what kinds of epistemic practices they are referring to, and in this manner, diversity can become sharp. So the overall thesis of the whole project is that philosophy of cognitive diversity should be intimately tied to the philosophy of scientific practices. And it's only through specifying what practices we're referring to does it even make sense to talk about an epistemic benefit of cognitive diversity. Thank you.